Good morning and welcome. My name is Laura Jacobs and I am the Education and Outreach Director for the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. I would like to welcome you today to the webinar titled Persuasion, a Cornerstone of Effective Advocacy, presented by Tom Grady. Mr. Grady currently serves as Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs for the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey and has done so since October 2002. The mission of the Alliance is to support and advocate for individuals affected by brain injury and raise public awareness through education and prevention. One of his roles as director is to serve as staff liaison to the Council for the Head Injured Community, one of the Alliance's advocacy committees whose mission is to champion and publicize the advocacy, rights, and needs of people who have survived a brain injury. Additional roles as director include, but are not limited to, being a chair of the Alliance's Advocacy and Public Affairs Committee and of the United States Brain Injury Alliance's Public Policy Committee. He is also a member of the Kessler Foundation's Northern New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury System Advisory Board. He previously served on Moss Rehabilitation's TBIMS Advisory Board from 2012 through 2014. So, with no further ado, Mr. Tom Grady.
Thank you, Laura, and good morning to those of you who are attending. As Laura mentioned, my name is Tom Grady. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs for the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. It's a role I've held since October 2002. However, my personal story with brain injury began about 21 years earlier on January 7th, 1981. I had been outside playing in the snow with a good friend of mine. It had snowed the night before and with an unexpected day off from school. So like any normal 10-year-old, 5th grade boy, we all went outside to play. And little did I know that as I was playing, my life was about to change forever. And not only was my life about to change forever, it was about to be in extreme danger. All of a sudden, like a bolt of lightning out of the sky, I got a very bad headache. And I went to the doctors, and eventually woke up in the middle of the night with a very severe headache, a very severe stiff neck, and very, very, very sick. My parents took me to a hospital where a spinal tap determined that I had internal bleeding. And the question became, why was I bleeding internally and where was it coming from? So from there we went to a hospital in New York City where it was determined that I had a ruptured arteriovenous malformation, AVM for short, which basically is a bundle of blood vessels that are malformed, and over time they weaken and they burst, and in effect causing a stroke. So luckily I survived, and I survived with minimal side effects, and that's the end of that story. You fast forward about 20 years, I joined a group called Toastmasters International, and the mission of Toastmasters International is to help people become better speakers and better leaders in the community in any endeavor they choose to engage in. And I'm proud to say that I earned the highest level of Toastmaster can earn, which is Distinguished Toastmaster. And even with that said, I still have much work to do. It's a never-ending process of learning. Then lastly, you fast forward about 21 years later, I found myself working for the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey, which is kind of an odd twist of fate considering where I was about 20 years earlier. And I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of people in my time here at the Alliance, and particularly people who've had AVM. And it's very humbling that I've survived the same affliction they had. So the reason I say these things, I open up with this, is because all three of these instances, my experience, my personal experience with brain injury, my time with Toastmasters, and my time with Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey, I think makes me uniquely qualified to discuss today's topic, persuasion, a cornerstone of effective advocacy. So I'd like to just open up with a question. What do you think persuasion is? Anybody care to take a stab at that? I'll give, and Laura, where maybe they type in the box the question they have, so make sure I'm clear on the direction.
Where it states, they can type it in with where it says chat to everyone, or they can also put it in question and answer. They have a choice of either.
Thanks, Laura. I think you all probably heard that. You can type in the question in chat or question and answer, Q&A. So if you have any ideas or what you think persuasion is, please offer them up. I'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute. Okay. Did not receive any ideas, so I'll just move along with what I think persuasion is. Persuasion occurs, this is one definition of persuasion, when a person or persons is thinking and or acting in a way another wants them to think and or act. Typically, you think of persuasion as being used in the court of law. That's why I chose the picture of a courtroom setting. And if you notice, the carpeting is purple, which tends to be the color for BIANJ Alliance of New Jersey. So I thought it very appropriate. But typically, people think of persuasion being used in this particular context. So the objectives for today, we have 3 objectives. Objective 1 is to define persuasive messaging, i.e. that of persuasion. Objective 2, to know where and when persuasion can and should be used. And lastly, objective 3, to learn how to structure a persuasive message. And I'd like to draw your attention to the objective 3, to learn how to structure a persuasive message. Because I think that a lot of people, when communicating, and particularly with regard to communicating a persuasive message, whether it be in the court of law, whether it be in the state legislature, whether it be before insurance company, if you're trying to appeal to a decision on an insurance claim, people need to concisely structure the communication to make sure it's not too long, make sure it's not too short. You want to strike that balance between having, saying the right thing in the right amount in the shortest amount of time. So, if you don't think anything else from this webinar, please focus on objective 3, and I will eventually get to the objective, obviously. I do have one definition of persuasion, quote, making someone believe in your ideas against their own. It's pretty unique, and I think that's a very good thing, because I think a lot of people have preset ideas on a certain topic or a certain issue or a certain activity. And if they are to be persuaded, you have an idea being presented in competition with the person's own belief system. So the idea of the persuader is to really eclipse what the person's current belief system may be. So that's a pretty interesting definition of it. Objective 1, to define persuasive messaging, i.e. of persuasion. In addition to the definition I've provided before, to have someone think and or act in a way one wants them to think and or act. There's 2 other definitions which could obviously pertain to persuasion. One is to prevail on a person to do something, as by advising or urging. For example, we could not persuade him to wait. 2, to induce to believe by appealing to reason or understanding, convince. Example, to persuade the judge of the prisoner's innocence. Excuse me. That second definition, to my mind, speaks to the definition offered by one of you, making someone believe in your ideas against their own. So what does a persuasive message look like? One thing to keep in mind, that even though you may have something to say and you have an important issue to address, it really is about the person receiving the message. It's about the audience receiving the message. They're the ones who have to be persuaded. So you have to try and look at things from their eyes. Try to put yourself in their shoes. That's why you don't want to say too little. You don't want to say too much. So therefore, the messenger, you, is prepared and knowledgeable, both about their interest, the thing you're trying to persuade the person to accept, and about their communication partner. And I say about the communication partner because if you know something about that person that you're trying to persuade, that you're trying to communicate with, if you know something about that person, you can better tailor your message to them. And as a result, it could build a relationship and build a bond and therefore make it easier to persuade them. As part of my job as Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs here, I do government relations, particularly at the state government level. So whenever we have a public policy initiative that we're trying to advance or trying to prevent, for that matter, I always try and learn something about the legislator or legislators that I'll be communicating with. And there are quite a few examples of this. One of our champions for one of our issues, actually a couple of our issues, is State Senator Tony Bucco. And before I met with Senator Bucco to discuss a certain issue, I did research on him and found that he had a family member who had a disability. So understanding that perspective helped me kind of tailor my conversation to the senator. And incidentally, when I did meet with him on several occasions, I found him extremely accommodating and open to helping out people with not only brain injury, but other types of issues. Another example is another state senator, Richard Cody, who I learned is involved in youth sports activities. I believe he's a basketball coach. He was involved with our sports concussion efforts back in 2010, which created the concussion law, which is currently in effect here in New Jersey. Another person is Assembly Democrat leader Lou Greenwald. I learned some time ago that his wife was involved in rehabilitation in some way, shape, or form. So when I met with him, he was very well engaged and very well attentive with regard to the issues we were bringing to the table. But then on the flip side, you may be in a situation where a person really does not know much about brain injury, and you learn something about them during the course of a process of educating them about brain injury, and as a result, they become knowledgeable, they become engaged, they become one of your allies. So the point here is that to furthest extent possible, try and learn as much as you can about the people you'll be communicating with, and in hopes that you'll be able to persuade them to accept your point of view. So with that aside, you also want to make sure your message is clear. You want to make sure it's brief. Again, that balance between saying too much, saying too little, which we'll address in a few minutes. And also, a messenger appears honest, sincere, and trustworthy. And one thing I've learned also in my time here in the Alliance is when you're trying to educate a legislator or anybody for that matter, you not only have to appear honest, sincere, and trustworthy, you have to be that way, because I think fundamentally, if you don't come off that way, people are not going to trust you, and it's going to make it much more difficult to accept your persuasive message, to abide by your point of view. And lastly, and also most important for purposes of this slide, the messenger has asked the person they're trying to persuade to take a particular action. If you go to a meeting and you don't have a call to action, you don't have a request for somebody to take a certain action, there's really no sense in you having the meeting to begin with. Anybody have any questions? Offer any comment? Okay. Persuasive messages, they're also goal-specific. They're also organized, which we'll touch on shortly. They're succinct. They're free from background noise. And to illustrate, we're in the conference room right now. It's a very quiet atmosphere, and it's very easy for me to focus. So if you're in a situation where you have noise, where you have distractions, that could impact your ability to relay your persuasive message. And it's funny, as I'm saying this particular piece of the slide, my colleagues here at the Alliance are trying to hook up a computer. So even though I'm very confident they abide by, well, except for Chris maybe, but only kidding you, Chris. They're helping out the cause, let's put it that way. The idea is that to be free from background noise helps you communicate your message that much easier. And most of all, I think this is a very important point, you want to be jargon-free. And it's important because even though you may be technically an expert in some area, the person you're talking to, the person you're trying to persuade, may not be. I can remember a time, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, at one of our events. It was a Walk for Brain Injury Awareness event. I was talking to one of my colleagues about a certain policy issue. And with my colleague was his wife. And as I'm talking to my colleague, I was trying to engage his wife, as was he. And she had this bewildered look on her face, or this look that I somehow recognized. I'm looking, I'm thinking, she looks kind of familiar, but I really don't know her, but she does look very familiar. So it finally dawned on me that she had the same look that my wife has when I'm talking to her about certain policy issues. And I asked her about this. She said, yeah, I do have that look sometimes because I have no idea what you're talking about. It's over my head. It's too much jargon filled. So the point here is that if you are using jargon that somebody else may not understand, it's going to hinder your ability to persuade them to accept your point of view. And be personable. You know, people are people, and most people, I think, are good-natured. They are willing to help, especially when it comes down to the field of disability, particularly with regard to brain injury. So try and relax as best as you can. Don't get uptight. They're just people who are there to hear you out. If they are willing to hear you out, it means they have, I think, some sense of goodness in them. And most of all, be respectful. And respect comes really in 2 ways. One, just showing them basic respect. Thank you, appreciate your time and your consideration. But also be respectful of their time. And I'm being redundant there, but 2 instances come to mind. In the state legislature, every year, there's what's called the budget season, where the state of New Jersey creates the next state budget for the next fiscal year. And to that end, they invite people to offer up comments as to what they think should be included in the state budget. So the 2 committees that hold these hearings, the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget and Appropriations Committee, they have 5-minute time limits on how long a person can speak. So you go to a lot of people that day. And there's been a couple instances where I've seen people go over the 5-minute limit. The chairman or chairwoman of the committee would say, can you please wrap up? And the person, the speaker, would acknowledge it, and then keep going. Again, the chair would ask, can you please wrap it up? Okay, the speaker will say, and they keep moving on. And it goes on for a 3rd request, a 4th request. By this point, people are getting frustrated because A, apparently the speaker is not listening, and B, they're not being respectful of other people's time. So if you're not being respectful of a person's time or respectful of your communication partner, the person you're trying to persuade, it's going to make it harder for you to persuade them to act or think in a way you want them to think and or act. So oftentimes, persuasion, it starts at two people or maybe more people seeing the same thing in two different ways as replicated on the picture on the left. One person sees blocks of wood as 4 blocks of wood, the other sees it at 3. And the idea is to eventually get to yes. As you see in the right-hand side, getting to yes. That's a book that I read when I was way back in college a number of years ago. And it's thought to be one of the best books on not only persuasion, but negotiation. So before we go off to the second objective, is there any other comments? I'll give people a minute to offer up any comments. Okay, I do have one comment here. Quote, I know passion about a topic is important, but too much passion can turn people off. Can you share ways to temper passion and include it in a persuasive message? And the answer is yes. And I think that's by learning how to structure your persuasive message and also being mindful that too much passion can be a bit overkill. But to the person's comment here, I believe that the proper structuring of a persuasive message will be able to help you avoid having too much passion and being a bit more objective. So thanks for that comment, or actually question, I should say. Try to go to the next slide, Laura. For some reason it's not. Bear with for 1 second, please. We're having a technical difficulty. For some reason, I'm not going to the next slide. Okay. Thank you, Chris. I am at the next slide now. So, we're at objective 2, and this is a relatively short objective to elaborate on. To know where and when persuasion can and should be used. As I mentioned before, it's primarily used in a court of law, but it's also used in the state legislature, in the United States Congress. And we have used persuasion to create a number of laws here in New Jersey. For example, we used persuasion to make New Jersey the first state in the union to have a mandatory ski helmet law. We also used it years ago to expand the now former traumatic brain injury Medicaid waiver, which resulted in more people with brain injury being able to get services. We used persuasion to dedicate the 3rd Friday of each September as Concussion Awareness Day. And most recently, we used persuasion to create or designate the whole month of September as Brain Aneurysm Awareness Day. So persuasion is used in a lot of different activities, but again, in my line of work here, it's used to persuade legislators to accept a certain public policy position, and today I'm hopefully using it to persuade you to utilize the skills and knowledge I provide to you to benefit your particular lives. It's also used by advocates, i.e. you, when asking their elected officials to address a concern and or support or oppose a legislative proposal. And conversely, it's also used by elected officials when asking citizens, you, to vote for them. So it's really a two-way street. And the best, or actually two examples I can think of when advocates effectively use persuasion to get their concerns met comes in two forms, two stories. One, there was a gentleman who way back in 2000, it was pre-9/11, I heard, he visited the office of Congressman Bill Pascrell, who's still in office today. He was basically saying to the congressman that we need to do something to help out people with brain injury, and Congress and government is not really doing enough. So in response, Congressman Pascrell took this person's request to heart and founded the Congressional Brain Injury Task Force, which is still in effect today, some 18, 19 years later. So that resulted because one person took it upon himself to advocate on behalf, particularly of his son, who was a person with brain injury. And as a result, the congressman ran with it and created this task force, which is thought to be a clearinghouse of all things brain injury relevant to public policy within Congress. And secondly, most recently, we had a person expressing concern that certain funds can't be used to transport people with brain injury, some people with brain injury, to and from support groups. And as a result, this particular legislator and assemblyman in New Jersey introduced a bill that would allocate funds to transport people to and from support groups. So those are two examples where one person can make a difference. And the main point here is that you have to be able to persuade somebody to accept your view, but more broadly speaking, understand that even though you're one person, you really can change things, whether it be for yourself, or whether it be for the, or whether it's for the brain injury community as a whole. So you really do have more power, or you may have more power than you think. And with that said, there may be times you offer up the best argument, you're the most persuasive person going, and you may come up short. Unfortunately, that may be the case in certain situations, but if you learn how to persuade, if you learn how to structure your persuasive message, you're definitely going to increase your chances to have a person think and or act in the way you want them to think and or act. Okay, so a couple more comments here, and bear with me while I bring them up. How can I say everything I need to in such a short time of 5 minutes? That was from a few slides ago, and it's a very good question, because being a person who likes to talk, it's hard to really narrow these things down. One of the things there's two suggestions. One, you may want to join an organization called Toastmasters. Toastmasters organization, which I mentioned before, I'm a member of. As I mentioned before, the mission of Toastmasters, in part, is to help people become better communicators. And to that end, you have opportunities to prepare speeches based on certain objectives. But the key here is you have to keep your speeches limited to a certain time frame, depending upon what the objectives actually are. And in many cases at Toastmasters, it is 5 to 7 minutes. And to prepare for that, aside from going to Toastmasters, you want to rewrite, rehearse, reassess your conversational points over and over and over until you get it down to a relatively short period of time. Now, for example, I mentioned 5 minutes before with regard to that particular hearing. You may go to a meeting that the person may be allocating a half an hour to you, which is fine. But still, you want to act as if you have a relatively short period of time. You want to boil your points down to the essentials and just be mindful of a person's time. And also be mindful of their body language too. Because you may be able to tell when people are getting fidgety, when people are getting restless, that you may be overstepping your allotted time. So with that said, I would suggest joining a group like Toastmasters, number one. Number two, I would suggest, again, rehearsing, assessing, revising your comments. And then lastly, if you have a concern that you want assistance with, you can always feel free to give me a call here at the Alliance. I'll be happy to kind of counsel you on organizing your thoughts in such a way that could hopefully help you out. So thank you to the person for that comment. And there's another comment here. Am I the only one with terrible audio connection? Oh, okay, that's a technical issue. So
I will check that out for you.
And Laura, my sidekick here, will do just that. So I apologize for any audio problems there, and which illustrates a point made before. If you have technical problems, background noise, or no noise in this case, or limited noise, it does hinder a person's ability to be persuasive. So I was going to give Laura and Chris a couple of moments here to address, or a moment to address this issue. And if there's any further questions, please offer them up now while we have some time here.
Tom, the audio seems to be fine.
Okay.
So it might be that one person. Maybe they could check their speakers.
Okay. To the person who offered up that comment, I'm leaving particular names out just for the sake of privacy. You may want to try loading or adjusting your audio to make sure that's fine. And as an FYI, if you can't resolve the problem now, this seminar or this webinar will be recorded. It's being recorded, I should say. So you can go back and listen to it later. So it won't be the only opportunity you have to listen to these hopeful words of wisdom I have for all of you. Okay. Going to the next slide here. I'm trying to the next slide. It seems I have, every time I click on the expand button for question or comment, I get stuck. Again, sorry for the audio problems. I apologize for that. That's what I actually did. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the next slide, objective 3. Every time I click on the, here, up there, that's what I was doing. Right there. So you click that, and then you click the arrow? Yeah. Okay, that was the stuff I was missing. Thanks, Chris. Okay, objective 3. And again, just want to reiterate, this is the objective that you want to focus on. If you take nothing else from this webinar, please take this section of the webinar to heart, and particularly this particular slide. So objective 3, to learn how to structure a persuasive message. One of the creative, innovative things or models I've heard over the years is you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them what you told them. It's repetition. And I learned that's used in meetings. For example, when I was meeting with the aforementioned Assembly Majority Leader, Lou Greenwald, years ago on the traumatic brain injury Medicaid expansion issue, he had asked me the same question 3 times in 3 different ways. And by the 3rd time, I was thinking, why is he doing this? Am I not getting the point across? But I think what he was doing, he was using the principle of 3 times to ask the same question, in this case, to make sure I was telling him the truth. I was being honest and forthright, which I was. So that talks back to being honest, being personable, being straightforward and sincere, but it also speaks to telling a person 3 times what your main message is. Repetition breeds familiarity. So with that said, any communication message, particularly a persuasive communication message, can be really broken down into, I think, 3 categories, which again we learn in Toastmasters: the opening, the body, and the conclusion. With regard to the opening, you want to pretty much summarize why you're there in 1 sentence, 2 sentences, not too much. Give them an overview as to what your concern is. And then your body. This is where the crux of your message is, whether it be persuasive or otherwise. You want to have 3 to 5 key points within the body. That would include supporting information, which I'll offer examples of shortly. But the reason you want to have anywhere from 3 to 5 key points is you don't want to shortchange your message and say too little, but you also don't want to be overkill and offer up more than 5 points, because then you run the risk of losing the person you're trying to persuade. So you want to try and keep your points at 3 to 5. If you notice, I had 3 objectives for this seminar, or this webinar, excuse me. And within those 3 points, I obviously have a lot of information kind of baked into that. So even though you may have 3 to 5 key points, a lot of the supporting information you're going to have may take up some time for you to communicate. So keep it at 3 to 5 key main points, or main key points, and that should address you saying too little or saying too much. And then the last part is the conclusion. At the conclusion, you want to reinforce and summarize the main ideas. You want to try and be memorable, particularly if you're speaking before a legislative body, for example. You want to maybe issue a challenge, ask a question, use a personal story or anecdote. Anecdotes and stories are very powerful tools to use when trying to communicate a certain point. Or you may want to use a quotation, a memorable quotation from a famous person that everybody may know of, because that would make your point easier to recall. And then lastly, which I mentioned before, whether you're communicating with one person, a couple people, a committee in the state legislature, or anywhere else, you want to ask for organization. You want to ask for, for an action. I was reading the next slide, forgive me. Ask for action. Again, if you go through this whole process of having a meeting and not ask for action, it really defeats the entire purpose for having the meeting or the conversation in the first place. Okay, so to create this body, this structure, how do you get it done? Step 1, you begin with the end in mind. Some of you may have heard of Stephen Covey, who is the late Stephen Covey, who was a communication/leadership guru up until his death several years ago, ironically from a brain injury. So basically, when you begin with the end in mind, you have a focal point. You have your bottom line. So to that end, you may want to ask the same question in 4 different ways, or with these 4 different points to help you get focused to achieve that end. 1, define the problem, concern, or interest that is important to you. 2, know what you want to accomplish and why. 3, define the specific end you want to realize. And 4, define the message, idea, or point you want to communicate. This is basically the same, these are different ways of getting to the same end. You want to try and crystallize and focus on what your bottom line is. One of my friends, one of my colleagues worked for State Senate President Steve Sweeney from the southern New Jersey area. And my friend had told me that Senate President Sweeney has a form that people use. And this form has a section that says something to the effect, bottom line. So the point is that when they have conversations with a constituent, you hear all these certain requests, they want to get down to the bottom line. What does the person want? And that's the type of thinking, I think, that can be particularly useful to any and all of you when you're trying to persuade a person to accept your idea or your thought. And then next, you want to develop the body of the speech. You want to employ ethos, logos, and pathos, which I'll be elaborating on shortly. You want to incorporate, again, the 3 to 5 subpoints or main points that support the message, idea, or main point you're trying to communicate. Now, as I mentioned before, each of those points could be used or can be supported by definitions, descriptions, explanations, examples, facts, statistics, authorities, testimony, stories, anecdotes, again, which I think are very effective, and visual aids, which can also be particularly effective. And then after you have all these pieces in place, you want to logically assemble the ideas into a cohesive message. You want to, again, use that organizing principle to help you logically assemble those ideas. So this ethos, logos, and pathos comes from, I believe, Aristotle. Now, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side and the text on the left, and reflect back on my initial opening, you may recall that I tried to build up your credibility and your trust by saying that, 1, I was a person who sustained an acquired brain injury. 2, that I'm a member of Toastmasters. And 3, I'm a longtime member of longtime staff member of the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. So my intent there was to build credibility and hopefully gain your trust that I'm a person who can be knowledgeable about talking about this particular subject area today. The second part is logos. Why should the person think and or act in a certain way? That's making the case. And again, that takes some preparation on your part in terms of organizing your thoughts, thinking in terms of why you should think a person should act or think in a certain way. For example, I spoke before about one of our most recent accomplishments being having September designated as Brain Aneurysm Awareness Day. The logic there was that brain aneurysms are not really commonly known. There's not much known about them. And if people don't know the symptoms and therefore not get medical attention, it could have disastrous consequences to the person, of course, their family, and other loved ones. So you got to have a certain logic there. And then lastly, you want to use some emotion. You want to use storytelling to convey the pathos piece of your logical and your persuasive argument. And again, the best example I can really think of in my 17 years I've been here at the Alliance, when I was advocating for additional slots for the traumatic brain injury Medicaid waiver, I testified before two committees, and one committee in particular, the Senate Budget and Appropriations Committee. I went there to speak about the logical part of the argument, why the state of New Jersey should expand funding for this particular cause, because it saved the state money, which it did. But I also had a father and a daughter there with me, and the daughter was a person with brain injury who, if I recall correctly, was not able to speak, so her father spoke about her situation and how the waiver, TBI waiver, helped not only her out, but helped out the family. And I recall the members of that particular committee being very attentive to what I said, but they were probably 10, 15, 20 times more attentive to what the father had to say about his daughter and about the impact, the positive impact that traumatic brain injury Medicaid waiver had on her daughter and their family. So the point I'm trying to make is that we effectively used, in this case, ethos, the credibility piece of things, because A, I was a professional in the brain injury field, and the father and daughter were real-life people, or people with real-life experiences pertaining to brain injury. We used the logo as part of it because I mentioned the cost savings to the state and why it made fiscal sense for the state to add slots to the TBI waiver. And then we used the pathos part of things, the storytelling part, to create that emotional aspect of things, to hopefully sell, if you will, those members of the legislature on expanding the waiver, which eventually they did. And not only did it expand that year, it expanded the following year, and those additional slots remained in effect for 10 years until the state changed the waiver system, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago. So when you're creating your main points, it may benefit you to have one point be ethos related, another point be logos related, and another point be pathos related. Put those pieces together, it's probably going to enhance your persuasive message even better. Okay, in step 3, create an opening or introduction. Now you may think that this would be the first step, but I think the opening and introduction, as well as the conclusion, should be done at the end, because both the opening and the conclusion should be reflective of your opening, your main reason, and which should also be repeated at your conclusion. So again, your main objective when you're opening up is to create or get the audience's attention by asking a startling question, stating a quotation, telling a story, or displaying a picture or an object. Again, that same process can be used when you're wrapping things up. You state your objectives. You may recall that I pretty much at the beginning of the webinar stated the objectives up front. And then you state your main message or focal point. And then just to reflect or repeat, you polish the conclusion or the end. You reinforce and summarize your main ideas. You close again with a memorable statement, such as a challenge, question, story, or quotation. And most of all, you ask the person to take a certain action. I repeated that several times before. If you recall correctly, use the power of threes. You say things 3 times, it kind of gets a bit overbearing at times, I imagine, but it will help the person remember what the most important points are. So you end with a call to action, and hopefully the result will be that the person that you're talking to, your communication partner, will act and or think in a way you want them to think and or act. So we have I did have a case study to go over. In the case we ran short on time, but as you can tell, I like to talk a lot. So we have 5 minutes left. So instead of going over the case study, I will take any questions or comments you all may have. I also want to reiterate, if you want any assistance or any consulting or any assistance with regard to organizing your persuasive message, feel free to reach out to me at the Alliance. I believe the contact information is going to be at the end, or should have been on my first slide or last slide. I will do that right now. There are our sponsors. I'll leave that up for a couple seconds to give them the credit they so deserve. And I want to say thank you to our sponsors. And the contact information is there. Please feel free to contact me at the phone number there or at email. And I got a couple of questions here. Okay. When presenting to persuade, does it matter who is in my audience? Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very good question coming from a communications expert who I happen to know that for a fact. The tricky thing is, as I mentioned before, you can do research on people, get some of their background. Other times you really can't. For example, I did this very same presentation, I guess it was 2-3 weeks ago now, at our annual seminar. And I had a sense of who may be in the audience, professionals that is, but I really didn't know who. There was no way for me to be able to tell. So it really did matter who was in the audience, but it was a challenge for me to learn how to really tailor my message to those people. So I try to keep things a bit general. So my recommendation would be, if you don't know who's in your audience, keep things simple, use universal language, but also I would seek out feedback from time to time in the audience. That way you can get a gauge of what their background is, what their values are, what their interests are, so that you can better tailor any further comments you may have to the entire audience. So thank you to that question. Laura was a communications expert too. I'll out her on that. Okay, next question. Hi, I am interested in speaking as an advocate and survivor, specifically about brain injury. Do you recommend joining Toastmasters? Absolutely. And if you are interested, please shoot me, sounds like you are, shoot me an email at tgrady@BIANJ.org. I'll find out where you live, and I'll be able to direct you to a club near you. And then you can contact that club, and they'll run you through the process that they have to join. So the second part of that question is, do you suggest any other organization or speakers bureaus to join in New Jersey, New York areas? I really don't know of any. Quite honestly, I've been very focused on Toastmasters because I frankly believe it's the premier one to join. I believe there is some seminars you can join or attend to at maybe Public Relations Society of America. I think that could be a resource, but I am very biased, if you will, toward Toastmasters International. You also have Dale Carnegie out there, which would cost, I think, some money, as does, by the way, Toastmasters, but our fees are relatively, I think, reasonable for a yearly membership. So again, I'd recommend that, and please contact me offline. I'll be happy to give you that information. And I have a request here to please send the recording to me. Again, if you send me your email address, I will be happy to do that once the recording is available. And then how do I get involved in Toastmasters? Asked that question already. And Thank you. I will be in touch, and you're most welcome. So please do contact me, and again, contact me if you need any assistance with trying to organize your message. I'll be happy to help. So seeing no other questions, I think we're out of time. I'm 1 minute over, so I'm violating the principle I talked about.
We're fine because we did start a little later, and I do know Tom taking classes at college and stuff. They also say there's many things in the community, chances to present, whether it's through a religious organization or volunteering your time, helping reading to children. There's many different opportunities out there to help. So, but at this time, I want to take the opportunity to thank Tom Grady for taking time out of his very busy schedule to present on this great topic.
You're welcome, Laura. Incidentally, I'm doing a speech tonight at Toastmasters, too. So
there you go.
I'll be talked out today. So God bless my wife. She's going to be talking all night now.
So as Tom had said, if you have any questions that you weren't able to bring up during the presentation, you can always reach out to him at the email address or myself at ljacobs@bianj.org. Again, that's ljacobs@bianj.org. This presentation within the week will become on our website at BIANJ. You can, again, watch it at any time, or if you'd like to share it with others on how to